Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Thursday. When we last left off, I was talking about David Cameron's big society. There are several prime ministers that come after David Cameron. After David Cameron had put forward the Brexit vote, believing that it would go down to defeat, so he didn't see any harm in actually promoting it, he resigned, which was a real shock because David Cameron was the conservative version of Tony Blair, the young, pretty face, big ideas, great speaker. Everyone expected him to be on the scene for a long time, but Brexit brought down his career pretty quick. And then that, of course, the conservatives were still in power. I'll explain to you how a prime minister can actually leave office without without his party losing power. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Then Theresa May came, and Theresa May's sole goal was to shepherd Brexit through the Parliament in a way that would not destroy the Conservative Party and still bring along the rest of the country. She was not successful. She tried several votes for a Brexit deal. She couldn't get her own party to back it. And so she resigned. And that brought in Boris Johnson, who is the current prime minister, and was seen as a bit of a joke at the time. In many ways, is kind of the Donald Trump of Great Britain, but actually managed to put together a Brexit deal that his own party could support, just barely, and is so far still in power. But British politics is pretty turbulent these days. Brexit has really turned things upside down, as you're going to be reading in some of the articles that I've given you. Okay, so we are now going to go into our fourth section, which deals with political institutions. So we've talked about the making of the state, different types of events that brought about development in democracy. We've talked about economic policy. Now we're going to talk about political institutions. And in order to get an understanding of the functions of government in Britain, you really need to understand its basic structure, because it is not like the United States. It's different in many ways, which is rather surprising because the founding fathers were using Great Britain as a model. But in some ways, they were using Great Britain as a model of what not to do. Right? The fact that we created a federal system is a total rejection of the kind of unitary system that Great Britain put forward. So, I need to keep an eye on my PowerPoint slides here, don't I? First, I just wanted to let you know, as you were looking at the PowerPoint slides here, as to how Brexit has been so turbulent for the Tory party and the other parties as well. We see in 2010, the Conservatives are able to squeak a 48-seat lead on Labour. And by 2015, they actually are able to increase this. And one reason is, well, you need to keep in mind that there's a lot of disagreement over why we see this. Part of the reason is, according to some, is that the Labour Party went too far to the left. Of course, those who follow Tony Blair have argued that those who are on the left believe that the party didn't go far enough to the left, that it needed to go back to its roots of the trade labor unions. Both of those, I think, have merit, though of course they're opposite, but they both have some merit. But one of the main reasons, I think, as to why we see the Labour Party suddenly stop winning elections is because of this yellow little box down here, the SNP. This is the Scottish National Party. And there used to not be a Scottish National Party that was viable on the national scene. Scotland, of course, has always talked about seceding, but there was no political party that had any kind of popularity within Scotland. The Scots voted for Labour. And what we see happening here by 2015, as you can see, 2010, the Scottish National Party has hardly any any votes there, any seats. But by 2015, it has shot up. And that's largely because of the interest within Scotland itself in seeking to secede. They actually have a vote. It goes down to defeat. It is a close vote, however. And as Brexit has now passed in Great Britain, what we see a lot of talk in Scotland about is once again having a secession vote. And this time it might pass because Scotland voted overwhelmingly against Brexit. So this has affected the Labour vote, because that means that you now have fewer people voting for Labour in Scotland. But this box alone is not enough to actually make up the gap. Labour used to have a huge, overwhelming majority over the Conservative Party. I think a lot of it has to do with David Cameron putting forward a message that was able to swing moderates away from the Labour Party back to the Conservative Party. And this left then more leftists within the Labour Party to try and consolidate their power. And I don't think it's really helped. No offense against anyone who is on the left, but if you take a look at the 2019 election, when Labour was absolutely certain that it was going to win a majority with this strong leftist message, what you see is Conservatives actually picking up 48 more seats and Labour losing 60 seats. It was such a humiliating defeat that, in fact, the leader of the Labour Party had to resign as the leader, because he had told everyone, we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win, stay true to this leftist message, and it didn't work. Didn't work at all. And the Scottish National Party continued to pick up more seats, 13 seats. So this is where the House of Commons is as of December 2019. Okay, that takes us now to political institutions. First of all, we call Britain a constitutional monarchy. Yet, as I mentioned to you last time, Britain actually has no written constitution. It does, however, have a revered basis for its democracy through an unwritten constitution, which is made up of statutory law. And by statutory law, I, of course, mean acts of parliament. Whatever laws parliament passes essentially becomes part of that constitution. It's made up of common law. Common law is judge-made law, right? When you walk into a store and you slip in the store on an egg that has been dropped on the floor, this is not a brand new legal case. In fact, I have no doubt that 1,000 years ago, there was a judge who probably had to decide when somebody walked into a stable and slipped on a pile of horse shit, who was responsible. That's common law. When you simply take the facts as they are and plug them into a legal situation that has been around for, I'm not really joking, 1,000 years. When we take a look at British common law, it goes back that far. So the Constitution is made up of this judge-made law. And then finally, it's made up of legal practices and political customs. An example of a political custom that is actually no longer a political custom, but it was for centuries. You were expected to have a parliamentary election within 5 years. Now, until recently, there was no law that actually said that, but that had been the political custom for centuries. I don't really know how many centuries, but for centuries, it had been the custom. Within 5 years, the ruling government must hold elections. That norm would, if it would have been violated, would have been seen as not only very un-British, but probably would have led to the downfall of the ruling government, because this was such a revered political custom. Well, you may wonder, if it was such a revered political custom, why did they pass a law to ensure that you would now have elections every 5 years? Perhaps they were looking at the United States, right, where we have plenty of political norms that have been violated over the last 3.5 years. You want to make sure that you have something that sticks around, make it a law, put it on the books. So take all of these together: political custom, common law, legal practices, acts of parliament, and you have what the British will tell you is a constitution. Right? We don't need to write everything down on a piece of paper. We have it on hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper because we can keep track, the British would say. Right? We aren't so narrow-minded and easily distracted that we have to have it all on one piece of paper. We can keep track from the Magna Carta all the way forward. That is their constitution. It may be unwritten in the way that ours is, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a constitution. In terms of the legislature, there are two houses to Britain's parliament: a House of Lords and a House of Commons. Members are elected to the House of Commons from regional districts, just like we are here. All right. The United States is divided up into representative districts by state. That's not, however, how it is done in Great Britain. There are no states in Great Britain. Great Britain itself is simply just, there are nations in Great Britain, of course. We talked about Scotland and Wales and England, but there are no states in Great Britain. So the entire country is simply divided up into regional districts, and these regional districts then will elect a member of parliament. These members of parliament, the MPs, they will then choose a PM, a prime minister. So the prime minister is not democratically elected by the people of Great Britain. I suppose I don't need to remind you that neither is our president democratically elected by the people. The president is elected by the Electoral College, right? So this shouldn't be so shocking. Oh my God, they don't elect their own leader. Well, neither do we. So the prime minister, as you will find in every parliamentary system, almost every parliamentary system, I can think of one example where that may not be the case, but in Great Britain represents the model for the parliamentary system. And the prime minister will be chosen by the members of parliament. But the prime minister is elected as a member of parliament. So the PM is chosen by the MP, and the PM is himself an MP. He runs as a member of parliament from a particular district. Now, does this mean that the public is surprised at who the prime minister is? No, of course not. The public will vote for the Conservative Party, for the Labour Party, for the Liberal Democratic Party, knowing full well who will be chosen as prime minister should that party win a majority. So it's not a surprise. People in England voted for the Conservative Party in 2019 because they knew that Boris Johnson would be the prime minister.
Do they have an equivalent of a party convention per se to determine who's their party leader? Or how do they determine like who is the party leader? Because obviously that person will be invited, by the crown to be the PM and form a new government.
The party leader is chosen by the members of his party. So for instance, Boris Johnson will be chosen by the Conservative members of the party. And then he will stand for prime minister. He will then be voted on by the parliament. Everyone who is not a member of the Conservative Party will vote against him. But if he has a majority, it doesn't matter. He's going to win anyway. Okay.
Is this very similar to kind of just having like in America, the House of Representatives, and then they elect the Speaker of the House? Is that how it is?
It's similar. Yeah, it's similar to that. Everybody knows, for instance, that Nancy Pelosi is going to be the leader, is going to be the House of Representatives Speaker. But at the same time, the Speaker of the House doesn't have nearly the kind of power that the Prime Minister.
No. But what I'm saying is that is it as if America was the same as Great Britain, would it be like electing the House of Representatives and then the Speaker of the House would be the Prime Minister? Is that? I
understand what you're saying, but it's apples and oranges that you're making. Right?
Okay.
The United States is not like Great Britain. It has a congressional system.
Yeah.
So so the answer to your question is no. It's not the same. It's completely different. Okay. All right. So in contrast to the House of Commons, the House of Lords is wholly unelected, consisting of the social elite of society based on hereditary rights and prime minister appointment. So the House of Lords is not democratically elected. It has always been made up, in fact, of the elite. But, well, so is the House of Commons, of course, but it has been made up of the super elite. You know, we're talking the barons, we're talking the lords, we're talking those who have the highest status. That was always the House of Lords. The House of Commons was always seen as representing the people, whereas the House of Lords has always been seen as representing the elite's interest. But because we see this development of democracy and a change of thinking in what purpose government should have, should the government actually be representing the elite or should it be representing the people? What we see in the political conflict between the House of Commons and the Crown is that eventually it comes to the people. And therefore, the House of Commons has ultimate power over the House of Lords. The House of Lords can slow things down, but it cannot defeat any legislation that the House of Commons wishes to pass. All right, now, you may be thinking, oh, well, that sounds kind of like the Senate. But again, keep in mind, we're talking apples and oranges here. Here in the United States, you cannot pass a law unless the House and the Senate agree on the exact wording. And then, of course, the president must sign it. Only then does it become a law. But in Great Britain, the House of Commons can pass any legislation at once. The House of Lords can slow it down. And that is a very important task. Let's say, for instance, that you want to raise taxes to 90% on rich people. And the House of Lords, which represents rich people, by the way, would say, that's not a very good idea. And the reason it's not a good idea is because it's going to hurt economic growth, because it is punitive, because you're not going to get any benefit by it. Now, if the House of Commons is absolutely determined to raise that tax to 90%, all they have to do is vote on it again. But chances are they are going to reconsider, because the House of Lords, its task is to reduce the passions, to reduce the fervor of the House of Commons when they pass ill-advised legislation. And so in this way, the House of Lords, because it has no elections, right, the House of Lords is seen as a body of experts who can put forward advice which the House of Commons is free to reject. And the House of Commons, for instance, did reject it. I think the House of Lords actually voted down the Brexit plan that Boris Johnson had put forward. But it didn't matter, because Boris Johnson had the votes in the House of Commons to get it passed. So the House of Lords serves as, again, one of those relics of tradition that the British love, but it doesn't serve any kind of democratic purpose, small d, democratic purpose. It can provide expertise. It is a chamber of revision, but all of that can be rejected by the House of Commons. So it can slow legislation, but it cannot defeat legislation. Now, the political system in Britain is often referred to as the Westminster model, which emphasizes that democracy rests on the supreme authority of a legislature and the accountability of its elected representatives. Therefore, the British state is a centralized one from the top down, without any separation of power between legislative, executive, and judicial branches, as we see here in the United States. This is a unitary system. A unitary system is the opposite of what we have. We have a federal system. It's not necessarily a direct opposite. I suppose a confederal system would be a direct opposite. A confederal system would be, there is no strong central government, states have all the power. Within a federal system like ours, as I hope you will remember, power is shared. It's not shared equally, but it is shared. In a unitary system, all power is centralized. Now, listen to everything I'm going to be talking about here, because this is what your first midterm is on. You're going to be comparing and contrasting federalism to unitary systems. And you're going to be using examples from Great Britain and from Japan as unitary systems, and Germany and the United States as federal systems. So under a unitary system, all power is centralized. But what you are going to learn is that even unitary systems can have differences, just as federal systems can have differences. There are powers, for instance, that the German government, national government, has that the US government does not. And there are powers that the states in Germany have that the American states do not. In Japan, you actually have a separation of power among branches. There is, for instance, an independent judiciary. This is a congressional system in Japan. But in Great Britain, under its unitary system, there is no separation of power. And that's because this is called the Westminster model. Japan does not use the Westminster model. Japan is a unitary system, but it does not use the Westminster model.
What makes it unitary?
Because all power is centralized in the national government. That's what makes it unitary.
Oh, okay. So that, yeah, okay. That's the distinctive
That's
factor of
most
the unitary
important
system.
thing to
Okay.
remember. So you can have separation of power within the national government. You will find, for instance, that there actually is the legislature in Japan actually is two separate bodies, and you have to have agreement in many regards to get something passed. That's not the case in Great Britain, right? You will have an independent judiciary in Japan, but that's not the case in Great Britain. Because in Great Britain, and this is a key phrase, in Great Britain, Parliament is supreme. Parliament is supreme. Whatever law Parliament passes is the law of the land. Now, there is a Supreme Court. This was created back in the years of Tony Blair, because there was the sense of, well, maybe we should create some checks and balances here at the national level. And one way to do that would be to have an independent judiciary, because it used to be that the House of Lords actually served as a Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court was created, but the Supreme Court is not independent. The Supreme Court can pass a decision by saying Congress, or by saying Parliament, your vote on Brexit was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court in Great Britain could say that, but all Parliament has to do, all it has to do is pass a law which says that vote was constitutional. And it is, because Parliament is supreme. Parliament has the ability to overrule any body of government within Great Britain, whether it be the courts, whether it be the city councils, and I'll give you some examples here in a few moments. Yeah, go ahead.
Doesn't like Scotland or like Northern Ireland have their own independent parliaments? Where do those fit into the unitary system?
Great question, Ian. Great question. Parliaments has given Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales some independent powers. They have allowed them to create their own regional legislature, which would govern, for instance, schools, maybe take care of some roads, things like that. But here's the thing, and this is just so important to remember. Here's the thing. What Parliament gives, Parliament can take back. So Parliament has given these regions the ability of limited self-government. But if Parliament wanted to pass a law tomorrow and take that back, it could. Now, let's say that the Trump administration wants to say to California, you are no longer going to be in control of your school system because we don't like the fact that you're using the 1619 project. Therefore, the federal government is going to take over your school system. Can the Trump administration do that?
No.
Please, somebody tell me no.
No.
Thank you. It cannot, because in fact, police powers, which include schools, are a state power that is protected by the Constitution. And so the Trump administration or the Clinton administration or whatever administration you want to do cannot simply come in and say to a state, we don't like the way you're doing something under your own powers, and so we're going to take over. It can't do that because we have a written Constitution which guarantees These are the state powers, these are the federal powers. But in Great Britain, Parliament is supreme. And so whatever Parliament wants to do, it can do. Today, it can give Scotland its freedom. Tomorrow, it could chain it up again. That's a unitary system. Go ahead.
At the same time, while they're not allowed to, for example, like do what Trump would want to do with California, aren't they able to withhold federal funds, for example?
Sure. Yeah, because the federal government controls its own funding.
So in America, it would lean more. There's a lot more power with the federal government because of the money that they could hold states hostage with, if that makes sense, without being too
No,
cruel.
yeah, I understand what you're saying, but California doesn't have to accept that money. California can simply say, all right, we're not going to take the education funding, which is actually minuscule. The federal government provides hardly any funding to education anyway. So this threat was always an empty one from the Trump administration. But California can simply say, all right, we aren't going to accept your federal funding. And instead, we're just going to raise taxes because California has the power to raise taxes under the Constitution. So it's really up to California whether it wants to take that money or not, but it's not bound to.
Thank you.
Sure.
Does Britain, would you consider it having a bicameral legislature, or is it just a unicameral because only the House of Commons can actually pass stuff?
Right, great question. During the Blair years, there also was talk about how the House of Lords should be made a more democratic institution. It never happened. The Brits love tradition. And so there was no democratic reform that came about with the House of Lords. Okay. But that's probably because the House of Lords doesn't really have any power anyway, right? If the House of Lords really truly had the ability to stop legislation coming out of the House of Commons, then you would probably see an outcry for greater reform. But right now, I think the Brits simply recognize that it serves an important function, and you know why fix something that's not broken? Okay.
What does the Queen represent in Great Britain's government?
I'm sorry, what about the Queen?
What does she represent? Like, is she just like a political figure for the...
Yeah. Be patient, my friend. We'll get to that. Now, there are no state governments, as I said, in Great Britain. There are only local city councils. And these local city councils can only exercise whatever power Parliament is. That's not my phone. Whoever has a phone, please. Okay, so local city councils. Back in the Margaret Thatcher era, I need to give you this example before we move on. Back in the Margaret Thatcher era, there were city councils that were eager to raise spending because Margaret Thatcher had been cutting the welfare state. Remember, her enterprise culture was all about how we're going to reduce the welfare state and revitalize the British economy by cutting taxes, by cutting spending, and by forcing people off of welfare to get back to work. Right? We're going to promote self-initiative rather than this kind of welfare dependency. Many city councils around the state that were still controlled by Labour Party members decided that they were going to raise taxes in order to cover those welfare cuts that were coming from the national government. And the Thatcher administration, because it had a majority in Parliament, passed a law which said to the city councils, you can't do that. You cannot raise taxes. Because Margaret Thatcher was not cutting the welfare state at the national level just so the Birmingham City Council could raise spending. That would defeat the whole purpose of cutting taxes and trying to rejuvenate the economy. And because Parliament is supreme, and because in a unitary system, all power rests with the national government, city councils who tried to increase their taxes had no choice. They had to follow what the national government told them. That, of course, again, is a great contrasting example from anything that you'll find here in the United States. The Trump administration or the Obama administration cannot force states to do things. It can Well, there are certain things that the Obama administration or the Trump administration can force if it is a federal power. If we're talking about civil rights, for instance, Alabama cannot discriminate against African Americans because that is a violation of the federal Constitution. But if Alabama doesn't want to implement Obamacare, Obama can't make it. Obama can try and entice it with lots of federal money. But if Alabama still says we aren't going to take this socialist program, which is actually a free market-based program, but we don't have to go into that right now, then Alabama is entitled to do that. And the national government can't force it. In Great Britain, it can. In Great Britain, it could say to the Birmingham Council, you are going to implement this healthcare policy. You are going to implement this welfare cut. You are not going to raise taxes. And it has no choice because all power is centralized in a unitary system. The majority party in the House of Commons forms a government with the Prime Minister and cabinet. The Prime Minister serves as long as she has the support of her party. Unlike impeachment in the United States, a Prime Minister could simply be subject to a vote of no confidence. Now, it would only come in the House of Commons. The House of Lords has no role in this at all. In our impeachment process, of course, both chambers play a role. The House impeaches, that is, it indicts, and then the Senate holds the trial. In Great Britain, they don't bother to go through all that expense. All right, there's no time wasted here. There's no money wasted here. There's no, oh my God, did he say this? Was it a perfect phone call? No, if the majority party does not like what the Prime Minister is doing, all it takes is one vote, a vote of no confidence. Now, this is a big decision, obviously. It rarely happens because a political party which does so is essentially committing suicide. Not because there is an immediate election that will be called. As long as they can decide who the next Prime Minister will be, then the parliament stays in session until the next election comes around. The only reason there might be a new election after a vote of no confidence is if the majority party cannot decide who the Prime Minister should be. But in any event, it is still a suicidal decision because you are saying to the public, we have failed. I mean, imagine if the Republican Party had said at its convention, you know what? We think that Donald Trump has actually failed over the last 3.5 years, and we therefore are not going to nominate him. That would be an admittance on the part of the Republicans of failure. I doubt they would win many votes. And so you're not likely to see the Conservative Party or the Labor Party, if they happen to be in the majority, taking a vote of no confidence unless it is absolutely impossible to get them to resign. Usually it's not. Margaret Thatcher stepped down because she knew that if there was a vote of no confidence, she would lose it. Tony Blair decided to step down and give Gordon Brown time to sort of build up support among the Labor Party. He stepped down because he knew that if there was a vote of no confidence, he would lose it. Theresa May decided to step down because the party was so upset with her that if there was a vote of no confidence, she would have lost it. So rarely do you actually see a vote of no confidence coming about because the Prime Minister is not looking to sink their party's chances at the next election. They will resign gracefully. That doesn't.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I do have just 2 quick questions on this. If the PM resigns, does that mean the cabinet also has to go, or is the cabinet still there and they just put in a new PM?
It really depends on the Prime Minister. The only one who resigns is the Prime Minister. And when Theresa May came in, it was entirely up to her whether she wanted to keep the cabinet in place. I honestly don't know whether she replaced anybody. Since she was in the cabinet herself, she probably kept the members as they were. What's your next question?
And then the next question, when the PM resigns, is he still an MP? Like, can he still go back to the Commons?
Absolutely, absolutely. Unless he resigns his seat. And I believe that David Cameron actually resigned his seat as a member of parliament. So there would have been a special election for his seat. But otherwise, when Tony Blair resigned, I think that he remained a member of parliament at least through the end of the session.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Now, it's important to stress that while at one time Parliament worked as a legislative body on the basis of consensus, the rise of mass political parties in the 19th century changed this forever. Parliament as a legislative body does not have wide-ranging powers in considering legislation. All bills of any national importance are brought to the floor of the House of Commons, not by individual members, but by the cabinet. Therefore, rather than designing legislation, Parliament's function can be better described as reviewing it before giving final passage, or to put it more bluntly, rubber stamping it. This may be one reason why Parliament has a much different way of conducting debate than the United States Congress. US Congress, of course, has imposed very strict rules of decorum. In contrast, the British Parliament resembles a mashup of insults and catcalls, of which I'm going to show you a clip here in just a moment. But I need to dwell on this just a little further. Here in the United States Senate, every single senator has the right to amend a bill. Now, there have been efforts since the early 2000s to try and reduce that, restrict that, for instance, restrict the number of amendments, but there are ways that you can get around that. Every member of the House of Representatives has the right to put forward a bill. Now, that bill goes through committee, and the committee may simply say, no, we're not interested, and pigeonhole it. But in Parliament, you do not have the right really to do anything except complain. That's about it. And if you are a member of the Labour Party today, there is absolutely nothing for you to do in Parliament, because there are no committees that you're sitting on that's going to be passing legislation. All legislation comes from the cabinet. And the cabinet is not going to propose legislation unless it knows it can pass it. Boris Johnson, as I mentioned to you on Tuesday, is currently trying to get through a new Brexit deal. Not everyone in his political party is happy about it. Some of them are hoping to amend it. Whether he allows them to bring the amendments to the floor is entirely at Boris Johnson's discretion. And if he feels that the only way he can get majority support in the Conservative Party is to do that, he will allow them to do that. But if he thinks that he can get through this bill without any amendments whatsoever, without any changes at all, then he'll do so. And it doesn't matter what the Liberal Democrats say. It doesn't matter what the Labour Party says. It doesn't matter what the Scots National Party says. As long as the Conservatives remain in the majority and united in their voting, they will pass whatever legislation they want. And it doesn't matter what the other party says. And it doesn't even matter what members of the Conservative Party say, because in most cases, for reasons that I will have to explain to you a little later today, but a little later, in most cases, people, the members of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, if they're in power, obey the orders given to them. So if Boris Johnson says, you will vote for this, they will almost always say, aye, aye, sir. All right, let's take a look at how some of this debate can actually unfold. Very different from what you find in the US Congress.
Is that order, this is so time consuming. Come on, Mr. Hughes, spit it out, come on. Order! There is no point in waiting for silence. The honourable gentleman is going
for that decision is that the Prime Minister knows that the report of the Commissioner for Standards into cash for questions will be ready on Monday or Tuesday.
Mr. Speaker, recently a single mother with small children came to see me in Sheffield. She had with her a bundle of letters.
Mr. Speaker, the first point of recapitalisation was to save banks that would otherwise have collapsed. And we not only saved the world, saved the banks and saved the banks and led the way. We not only saved the bank. Mr. Speaker, total spending will continue to rise, and it will be at 0% rise in 2013-14. In 2011-12, and 12-13, it will continue to rise.
Order, order. The Prime Minister's answer must be heard. Prime Minister.
I think that answer gets 0%.
Now, I know how much he likes personalising politics, and I know. Of course, I know how he hates. I know how he hates Punch and Judy politics. When it comes to real policy, when it comes to discussing the long-term future of this country, he is not even in a comes to real policy. When it comes to discussing the long-term future of this country, he is not even.
I wish the Shadow Chancellor would occasionally shut up and listen to the answer. I don't know whether. I don't know whether. I will try and come to. I don't know whether.
Order. Other members can now follow the Prime Minister's advice to the Shadow Chancellor. We need a bit of order. The Prime Minister.
I may be alone in finding him the most annoying person in modern politics, but anyway, I'm sure. No. I think I've got a feeling the leader of the opposition will one day agree with me. But there we are.
He can embarrass himself. He can disgrace his party. But what is intolerable is that he has cynically raised the hopes of hundreds and thousands of families. You're a miserable pipsqueak of a man, John! You're get your finger away.
Order. Before we go any further, I must ask the honourable gentleman to withdraw the term that I think he used. I think I heard the term pipsqueak. The honourable gentleman must withdraw that term. It's not appropriate.
Perhaps out of
What I'm doing, you leave this matter to me. Mr. Tom Watson.
Out of deference to you, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw it.
I'm grateful to the...
Mr. Speaker, the House has noticed the Prime Minister's remarkable transformation in the last few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean.
The Prime Minister talks about salesmanship. We all know his brilliant salesmanship.
Okay. Guys, give me just a minute. I thought that I had something else. The Speaker of the House, who recently just retired, was among the sharpest tongued speakers that they have ever had. And I just want to see, I thought that last year I had downloaded, but maybe I didn't put it on. Let me just do a quick check here. London riots. Yes. Get
the bill through first in order to prevent.
Okay. Let me bring this up and show it to you.
Get the bill through first in order to prevent, in order to take no deal off the table.
Order! Very rude for members. Order! I say to the Chancellor of the Duchy that when he turns up at our children's school as a parent, he's a very well-behaved fellow. He wouldn't dare behave like that in front of Colin Hall, and neither would I. Don't gesticulate, don't rant, spare us the theatrics, behave yourself, be a good boy, young man, be a good boy. Point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford. Yes, we know the theatrics that he perfected at the Oxford Union. Not interested. Be quiet. Point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Can you imagine a Nancy Pelosi doing something like that as Speaker of the House? Might be more fun to watch the Speaker of the House. All right, so let's get back to the PowerPoint here.
How are the Speaker of the House elected in Britain, or are they elected?
Yeah, Speaker of the House is elected by the majority party. So the Democrats, as long as the Democrats stay in power, Nancy Pelosi will be the Speaker.
Oh, no. I meant, sorry, I meant the guy we just watched.
Oh, great question. That also is a, normally the Speaker position is simply a ceremonial position. Usually it will be given to someone who is very popular from both parties. The majority party, for instance, doesn't have to give it to a majority party, particularly if it's a very tight parliament and giving up one seat might actually change the balance. They might just bring in somebody from the minority party. It's very rare that you have a Speaker of the House as powerful as the one that I just showed you. Mainly they're just sort of weak, order, as everyone is screaming around. But this last speaker, he didn't take any crap. And it's a shame to see him go. He actually was a member of the Conservative Party, as I recall, and was speaker even when Labor was in power, because he was so respected that Labor didn't fear having a Conservative member as Speaker of the chamber.
But they're not an MP.
Yes, they are.
Oh, they are an MP. Okay.
Yes, they are elected as a member of parliament. Yeah.
Okay.
How was it that they decided to have that like comedy show, I guess?
I'm sorry, Alexander, say that again?
Because it seems like a little funny the way they agree and talk in parliament.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you mean funny, ha, I would agree. If you mean funny as in this is really bizarre, from our own system of government, we have very strict rules of decorum. In fact, Lyndon Johnson once explained that because you have to follow these rules, if you wanted to call a fellow senator a son of a bitch, then you would say, my distinguished friend. If you wanted to call him an extreme son of a bitch, you would call him the very distinguished friend. So there are certain rules that we follow within our system in order to remain polite. The British have never followed that. Their House of Commons have always been pretty wild affairs.
Dr. Kelly, I think it's odd because in our last class, we talked a lot about how Britain is so ruled and so rooted in its tradition, like how we saw with the Queen reading the speeches, and it seemed very civil. So it's just really weird to see that huge contrast in attitudes, I guess.
It does seem very un-English, doesn't it? You know, we think of the English as extremely proper, and we must follow the certain rules, and you must drink the tea in a certain way. But when they get in front of each other in the House of Commons, they are just ripping each other's a new asshole. It is amazing what they will go through there.
The English like their comedy.
What's that?
Just the English like their comedy.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's very British. All right, guys, great questions and comments. Let's move on here and talk about the executive. Someone was asking me earlier about what role the Queen plays. So let's talk about that. As a constitutional monarchy, the Queen of England serves as the official, or more appropriately, ceremonial head of state. Remember, I explained to you that here in the United States, we have a fused executive, that the president is both the chief executive officer and the head of state. In many countries around the world, you actually see those two positions separated, so that the head of state will be the one who is there to open up, you know, the special clean fueled energy plant, the one that will welcome dignitaries coming into the country, but not the one that actually makes any decisions. Instead, the head of state represents the nation. And that is what the Queen does. The Queen is a symbol of the nation. The Crown requests the formation of a government only after the elections have already decided who will win and form that government. The Crown lays out the country's economic and domestic priorities through a speech that is always written by the majority party. So you can have the Queen at the opening of Parliament say, one year, we are going to do everything we can to build a more equitable and just society by building up the welfare state, only to have Labour lose the next election. And then the year after that, the Queen is out there saying, we are going to do everything we can to reinvigorate this society by building an enterprise culture that dismantles the welfare state. You would think that she was psychotic, giving one speech like that and a completely, totally different speech the next year, except that she doesn't write them. She does not set economic policy. She merely announces what the party in power has done. She even signs, she must agree to all legislation that is passed. Still today, whenever a law is passed, it will then be taken to the Queen by the Prime Minister and his cabinet, and they will stand in a line in one of her chambers in which they will read the bill to her and she will say, approved, approved, approved. I've always wondered what would happen if she actually said rejected, because she has the power to do that. There is nothing written down on a piece of paper that says the Queen must follow what Parliament tells her to do. There is instead a political custom, a political norm. But what if you had a sort of Donald Trump queen or king who decided to completely break norms and had the political popularity to do it? Where would that put England? Well, I suppose my answer would be Parliament is supreme. And if Parliament wanted to pass a law that said, all right, from now on, the Queen is only a ceremonial figure and we aren't going to bother taking legislation to her, then that's what would be done, because Parliament is supreme. But that's a pretty drastic step. And as long as norms are followed in Great Britain, it's not a step that ever needs to be taken. Yet. Ceremonies aside, all decision-making power, therefore, in Britain, from foreign policy dealings to economic domestic issues, lay with the cabinet. Coming to those decisions depends entirely on the consensus building techniques of the Prime Minister. Most Prime Ministers, in fact, will seek to build consensus in their cabinet. But others, such as Margaret Thatcher, may be very strong-willed in imposing policies. And though grateful for her strong leadership, because it brought the Conservative Party to power and kept them in power throughout the 1980s and early 90s, party members bristled at being called her quote unquote political advisors. Until Margaret Thatcher, the cabinet had always had a consensus decision-making process. Indeed, once a cabinet makes a decision, everyone in the cabinet is bound by it. You cannot criticize a decision that is made by your cabinet. Now, that's the way it had always been in British political culture. And as long as you had the free give and take within these cabinet meetings, that was something that every cabinet member was willing to abide by. Margaret Thatcher changed that. Margaret Thatcher would simply make the decision, tell her cabinet what the decision was, and then they would be bound from criticizing her. Well, Tony Blair tried to get around that. He would say, we are going to maintain this collective responsibility, as it was called. Right? All members in the cabinet take responsibility for the decision made, even if they didn't agree to it, but they can't say it publicly. Tony Blair said, I'm going to get around this. Do I have another clip here? No. Tony Blair got around this by saying, I'm going to go to each individual cabinet member and get their opinion. And the only reason you would want to do this is if you were certain that if you took a vote within the cabinet that you would lose. And he knew that his cabinet opposed British participation in the Iraq War with the United States, because he had some very liberal members who absolutely were opposed to this. I do need to go on to the next slide. So tell you what, I'll give you a few more seconds. Is there anyone who has any questions before I finish my story of Tony Blair?
Can the PM just decide at any point to remove a cabinet member, or is that like bound in their common law that like only the parliament can do that?
Well, that's a great question. I do not know the answer to that, but if you don't mind a guess, my guess is that yes, if you no longer have the support and confidence of the prime minister, then she would convince you to leave. But I believe that each member of the cabinet is voted on by the party. And so if you were a renegade, a rebel, and you wanted to stay within the cabinet no matter what, and you could maintain the support of the majority of the party, then I don't think that the prime minister could actually get rid of you. But it would not be a healthy relationship. It would not be a government that would be working efficiently. I can't give you any examples, in fact, of where that has happened, though perhaps it has.
Thanks.
Sure. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to this type of cabinet parliamentary system. The ability to pass legislation in Parliament prevents the type of Washington-style gridlock that Americans have grown so frustrated with. But a disadvantage is the potential for excessive power by a prime minister who manipulates the cabinet structure to promote controversial issues that she knows individual cabinet members may not like, but then are prevented from criticizing. Therefore, there is no real collective responsibility since detractors are going to be marginalized. No doubt there were people in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet who thought that she was going too far in dismantling the welfare state so quickly. But they couldn't criticize her because once she made the decision, everyone in the cabinet was held responsible. Now, Blair, he came in saying, I'm going to be a different kind of prime minister. We're going to go back to the kind of collective consensus and responsibility that every member of my cabinet will feel in making a decision. But in fact, in the reality, Blair continued to narrow the scope of collective responsibility, as we can see from his decision to go to war in Iraq, which was never, ever fully aired in a debate in the cabinet. Instead, he would discuss the issue in small groups or bilateral meetings before being brought to the floor of Parliament for formal support. In fact, Blair said to his members, to his cabinet members, this is the decision I'm going to make. If you feel that it's not one that you can support, then you can resign. Now, that's a pretty big step, right? Because normally, under the collective responsibility, the prime minister will say, I've made the decision, sit down and shut up. But that's not Blair's style. Instead, Blair's style is to go to each individual cabinet member and say, I've listened to your concerns, here's my decision. And if you can't stay quiet, then you should resign. Some did, only a couple. It is amazing that the Labour Party was able to get this through. In fact, as I recall, I don't think that they even were able to get it through on majority support. I believe that they had some conservatives that were voting for them as well, which, keep in mind, the Labour Party had always been a party of tension. Blair was bringing it, forcing it, pulling it to the center in the same way that Bill Clinton was pulling the Democratic Party to the center. And liberals were resisting as hard as they could. But as long as Clinton kept winning in 92 and in 96, liberals just kind of stayed quiet. Well, liberals are now going through, let's call them the left, because they're more than liberals in Great Britain. In the Labour Party, you really have moderates and you have those that are on the left. And they didn't stay quiet for very long. As soon as Tony Blair was able to consolidate power, they were constantly trying to move him back to the left. But Tony Blair understood politics in Britain in a way that the left appears not to. If you want to build a majority coalition, then you have to govern from the center in Great Britain. You cannot govern from the left. Well, because Parliament is supreme in Britain, the courts have no jurisdiction to overturn a law passed by the House of Commons. If the courts find that Parliament or the government has in some way breached the established constitutional norms, then Parliament can simply pass a law that makes its actions and interactions more explicit. You don't think, Supreme Court, that the law we passed is constitutional? We now deem it to be constitutional. And that's it. Parliament is supreme. Parliament can simply pass a law to make whatever law the court didn't like constitutional. There would then be nothing unconstitutional for the courts to quibble over, since acts of Parliament are automatically constitutional. But we should remember that the Parliament is subject to an even higher court, and that is the court of public opinion. If perceived as arbitrary, in totally disregarding the court's ruling, it could alienate its supporters. But we should also keep in mind that this only matters if people are opposed to what Parliament does. And this is perhaps a good point for me to stress an important lesson for you. And that is that democracy works only if the people want it to work. You can have all of the written constitutions that you want, but if the people and their representatives choose to ignore it, then they will. They absolutely will. In a parliamentary system like the Westminster model, it is even more imperative that you follow the political customs and norms that have taken you to the present. Because if you do not, you really could end democracy pretty quickly. If Parliament is supreme, and whatever Parliament passes is therefore constitutional, then there's nothing unconstitutional about Parliament passing a law which says we are now going to round up Muslims and put them in detention camps. Parliament is supreme. Could do whatever the fuck it wants. That's the danger in a parliamentary system. Here in the United States, we of course have a constitution that would prevent Congress from doing something like that. Sometimes it doesn't always work. When you take a look after 9/11 and the federal government, in fact, did start to round up Muslims, that was a violation of their civil liberties. The courts are there to protect those civil liberties, but it took the courts a few years, seriously, a few years before they finally got around to saying, okay, yeah, I guess we should protect these civil liberties. Because initially the court said, we see this as an era of war, and therefore we're going to give the executive administration leeway in how it acts. But there's nothing in the Constitution that actually says that. And that's my point. Democracy only works if the people who are in charge of protecting and defending it make it work. We at least have guardrails, though those guardrails don't always work, but by and large they do. There are no written guardrails in Great Britain. It's based on political norms and customs. And if Parliament decided tomorrow to simply bust through those norms, well, Parliament is supreme. Parliament can do whatever it wants. One of the activities that I used to do in class, and we would do in class if you were all here in front of me, is I would split you up into political parties, of which you would choose yourself. You could choose a Labour Party or a British or a Conservative Party or the Liberal Democratic Party. And we would have a parliamentary system. And every year it's a little different. You know, some people think, okay, let's work with the other side, or they think, oh, okay, let's try and pass some laws. One year, I had some students who were talking very quietly in the corner of the room. They were the majority party. They were talking very quietly in the corner of the room, and we were all wondering what it was they were doing. And when they came back into the session then, what they decided to do was to pass some just crazy laws. Things like saying, everybody will turn off their lights at 3 p.m. in order to save energy. Everybody will now have the last name of Smith. And the opposition party was aghast. You know, they weren't laughing. They were angry because they thought that these students weren't taking it seriously. But in fact, those students in the majority party took it very seriously. They understood that as the majority party, and if Parliament is supreme, they could pass whatever they wanted, and that there was nothing the minority party could do. And that was one of the best activities I've ever had in my teaching, because those students understood the point that I was trying to make, that democracy only works if you are willing to defend it. British politics is currently subject to an external court, that of the European Union. Under the EU agreement between members, when an EU nation's domestic law conflicts with EU law, the EU law takes precedent. British law before Brexit could be struck down by the EU's Court of Justice, and the ruling would therefore be binding on British courts. This was, in fact, a real sore point for nationalists who value British sovereignty. Indeed, it was an argument offered in the pro-Brexit campaign. Now that Great Britain will be leaving the European Union, the European Court will no longer have jurisdiction over British courts. But that doesn't mean that the problem is simply solved. If Great Britain, for instance, wants to continue to do business in the European Union, which of course it will want to do because its economy requires it, it is still going to be subject to these kinds of laws. It, for instance, cannot enter into a trade agreement in which its factories do not have the same health and safety standards as French factories do. That would be unfair to the French factories if, for instance, British factories were not following the same guidelines. And so if an EU court said to Great Britain, you can't participate in this because of your factory standards, well, Great Britain has the sovereignty that it can simply say, then we won't be part of the trade union. We don't want to be part of this sovereignty that you're trying to, we don't want to give up our sovereignty. But at the same time, it is sacrificing a lucrative trade deal. So leaving the EU may not solve all of the problems,
But
Back-
those two bullet points don't necessarily apply now, right? Like as Britain
That's
leaves
right.
the EU.
It applies-
Specifically.
next year when I teach this course, I will be deleting it because by that time, Great Britain will be out of the EU. Currently,
But you're saying it applies indirectly because if they actually want to participate in like, economic areas and stuff, they will have to follow certain EU law and EU customs and whatnot. Yes, gotcha.
Sure.
Professor, didn't they already leave the EU, I think, end of January? Or was that something else?
Was it in January?
They did. They did leave January 31st, but that was with the withdrawal agreement. But they haven't figured out everything else.
They are still, as I mentioned to you, Johnson is still trying to get a leave deal passed through Parliament that is different than the one he had before. So the status of Great Britain in the EU is pretty confusing. It's a turbulent time. Party dominance, and we have time to do this. We'll stop at collective identities. Why do political parties dominate politics in Great Britain? And there are a number of reasons for this. First, Great Britain has no primary elections. Let's review. Here in the United States, if you are Kamala Harris and you want to run for the US Senate, actually forget that. I can't use that example because it's an open primary here. If you are, if you're Bernie Sanders and you want to run for re-election in the Senate in Vermont, you will run in the Democratic primary if you were a Democrat. All right, of course, he runs as an independent. Okay, Bernie Sanders doesn't work either. Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, that'll work. There will be a primary, a Democratic primary in Massachusetts in which they will have their election for each political party that says, we want this candidate to represent us in the November election. So in effect, Elizabeth Warren must run for two elections. First, the primary election in which she wins the nomination from the Democratic Party to be the Democratic nominee, and then she will run against the Republican in November. Great Britain doesn't have any of that. And the reason they don't have any of that is because party leaders choose who the candidates will be. Now, those party leaders could be in London, or those party leaders more likely are going to be in the regional district. But the point is still the same. The Labour Party will choose who the candidates will be. So, because there is also only one office to vote for in the national government. Your member of parliament. That's it. You aren't voting for vice president, you aren't voting for president, you aren't voting for senator. You're just voting for one person, your member of parliament. And because the executive branch and the legislative branch are controlled by the same party, voters cannot split their tickets between the two like we see here in America. We don't know who's going to win the presidential election, but we know who's going to win the House of Representatives, the Democrats. It's still up in the air as to whether the Republicans will maintain their majority in the Senate. Right now, things are not looking good. Poll came out yesterday, shows Maine, Susan Collins way behind. Kelly is ahead in Arizona. Tillis in a tight race in North Carolina. Cory Gardner could lose it in Colorado. If the Democrats take those 4 seats, they've got the Senate. The problem is the Democrats are going to lose the seat in Alabama. There's no way Doug Collins is going to win re-election in a deep red state, which means they got to find a 4th seat somewhere else. Maybe Montana, right? Steve Bullock in Montana, perhaps. Maybe win the Iowa seat. It's close there. We'll see. You don't have any of that handicapping going on in Great Britain because there's only one person to vote for, member of parliament. And so you can't split your ticket. You don't have divided government in Great Britain. Even if the House of Lords is controlled by members of the Conservative Party, which it probably is because they've been there for a long time, they tend to be part of the elite. It doesn't matter because the House of Lords doesn't have any power that it can stop what the House of Commons wants to do. Third and finally, party members are much more disciplined than in America. They will vote in a unified bloc as instructed by party leaders, and therefore allowing for a more unified and defined message. Now, if you are like most Americans and you don't like political parties, you would probably say, this system sounds so authoritarian. And it is. And you know what? It's a hell of a lot more effective than what we have here in the United States. I wish we had this authoritarian political party system here in the United States, because maybe we get something done, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, but we don't. In the United States, each member of the political party runs as an individual, so that there are even times where Elizabeth Warren may have to vote not what the party wants her to vote, but what her constituents want her to vote. Now, I can understand if you're thinking, well, of course she should vote what her constituents want. But that doesn't bring about a national unified policy. We look to political parties, both on the left and the right, to put forward a vision, a policy platform that we embrace. Sometimes we don't like everything about it. Right? Maybe you're pro-choice, but you vote for the Republicans anyway because you believe in small government and a strong military. In Great Britain, because each party member is chosen by the party leadership, there is very little dissent. Because if the party member says, well, gosh, I'm sorry, Boris, but I can't join you this time. I can't vote for your Brexit deal. Boris has the ability, working with regional party leaders who got you on that ballot, to throw you off the ballot so that you will not be running for re-election. There's no one that can prevent Elizabeth Warren or Senator Tillis from running except the voters, because they will get their nomination in a primary. But in Great Britain, and same thing in Germany, by the way, where you also have a very strong political party system, party leaders control this. Now, again, I can understand if you're thinking, well, that takes away the individuality and the independence of the member. And my answer to that is, yes, that's right. And that's why they get more things done. That's why when you have a prime minister that says to the people, we are going to dismantle the welfare state, that welfare state will be dismantled. Because that prime minister who has the majority will use his party power in order to fulfill his promises. Here, when Donald Trump says, elect me and I will dismantle Obamacare, Obamacare is still law because the Republicans couldn't get enough votes in the Senate in order to dismantle it. That's the problem with our political party system. And it's no wonder that Americans get so frustrated and so disengaged with politics because of the promises that are made and are never kept. So
is that necessarily a good thing, though? Right? Like, is it necessarily a good thing that a new government can come in and pretty much just steamroll new policies and completely change what the last government did? Like, I don't know if that's necessarily something we should strive for.
Yeah. Well, I can tell by your question that you think it's a good thing, and that's fine. But as a political scientist, what I would say is, if you want voters to stay engaged and if you want them to believe the promises of their political leaders, then those political leaders should probably keep their promises. But it's entirely up to, it's an opinion-based question. I wouldn't mark you wrong if you decided to argue against my position. I'm just giving you my academic position. But there are many different opinions that are out there, guys. It's important to remember that. I don't have all the answers. Don't tell my daughter that. She thinks I have all the answers. Now, such a system that we see in Great Britain, and this will be my last point, then I'm going to let you guys go. Such a system can lessen the influence of interest groups on individual members. That, I think, would be an advantage. Here in the United States, in a federal system where interest groups have many access points and can literally corrupt political party members, it is much more difficult to do that in a unitary system because there is only one access point in a unitary system, the national level. That's it. You want to abolish abortion? There is only one door that you can go through, the prime minister's door. You want to chip away at the rights of abortion here in the United States? You can work with 50 different states to do it. You can work through the court systems. You can work at the city councils and have Planned Parenthood offices closed. But in Great Britain, in a unitary system, there is only one access point. Trade unions were very important to the Labour Party when the Labour Party was in power. Now that the Conservatives are in power, trade unions have zilch influence. Instead, it's the Chamber of Commerce. It's the manufacturers associations. They're the ones that have the greatest influence because they have access to that majority party. So because British campaign funding is channeled through the national political party organization, interest groups must win over the leadership of the majority party in order to gain their political objectives. But here's the thing, in a unitary system, because there is only one access point, if you can get through that door, if you can get in to the halls of Parliament, into the back rooms where the cabinet is meeting, then you've got it easy, my friend. If you are the Manufacturers Association, if you are the Chamber of Commerce, and you have got the ear of the cabinet in the Conservative Party, then you have really an important access. That's the advantage and disadvantage, right? Interest groups have less access in a unitary system because there's only one point. But if they can get through that door, they have a lot of access and a lot of interest, a lot of influence. Whereas in a federal system, it may not matter that you have the Republicans in the White House and the Republicans in the Senate. You still have Democrats in the House. You have Democrats in state houses all across the country. You have Democratic city councils that would be sympathetic to your pleas. There are lots of ways you can stop the Trump administration, just as there were lots of ways you could stop the Obama administration. Have a great weekend, guys. We'll finish this up on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, I don't know what we're going to do because I think I'll probably finish this lecture on Tuesday. And so on Thursday, I would like to have some kind of discussion. I'm just not sure exactly how or what to discuss because it's not the kind of discussion we would have in class. So let me tell you this. Please have all of the online readings completed by Thursday, because whatever discussion we have, I may create some breakout rooms. Whatever discussion we have will be based on those online readings. So the online readings that are assigned for next week, I think this week you're just working on the textbook. Whatever online readings you have, please have them completed by Thursday. Have a great weekend. See you all virtually on Tuesday.